In the year 1821, a child was born in Moscow who would transform Christianity from a comfortable set of beliefs into a terrifying, beautiful confrontation with the depths of human existence. Fyodor Dostoevsky did something extraordinary. He took the suffering of the Siberian prison camps, the philosophical movements sweeping through Europe, and his own devastating encounters with evil, and forged them into a vision of Christian faith so raw and honest that it still disturbs comfortable believers today. But here's what makes Dostoevsky truly remarkable. He wasn't simply a believer. He asked questions that still haunt Christian theology today. Can faith survive in a world of senseless suffering? Is Christ's teaching compatible with human freedom, or does it require submission? Can someone choose God after staring into the abyss of meaninglessness? What does it mean to love your neighbor when that neighbor is capable of monstrous evil? Most Christian thinkers before him tried to answer these questions with systematic theology. Dostoevsky did something different. He showed that faith isn't a conclusion you reach. It's a battle you fight every single day. He revealed that doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It's an essential component of any faith worth having. He demonstrated that Christianity, when taken seriously, is far stranger, more demanding, and more redemptive than anyone had imagined. If you're finding this exploration meaningful, I genuinely appreciate it if you could hit that like button or subscribe. It really does help the channel grow and allows me to keep making these deep dives. I'm always fascinated to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment with your city and what time it is there right now. There's something beautiful about knowing we're scattered across the globe, but connected through these ideas. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights. Grab your favorite drink, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why Dostoevsky's Christianity is nothing like what you learned in Sunday school. Part 1. The Scandal of Freedom. Why God's greatest gift is his most dangerous. Let me start with the insight that makes Dostoevsky genuinely revolutionary, and it begins with a question so troubling most Christians avoid it. Why did God give humans free will if he knew we'd use it to create hell on earth? Every Christian theologian before Dostoevsky, from Augustine to Aquinas to the Orthodox Fathers, had their explanations. Free will is necessary for genuine love. Without choice, we'd be robots. God wanted beings who could freely choose him. They assumed that if you could justify free will philosophically, you'd solve the problem. Dostoevsky said, "You've all missed the most important question. The question isn't whether free will is justified, but whether it's survivable." Here's what he meant, and this requires careful attention. Take the most basic claim of Christianity, that God is love, and that he wants us to love him and each other freely. Now sit with what that actually entails. If love must be free to be real, then hatred must also be possible. If goodness must be chosen, then evil must be an option. If salvation must be accepted, then damnation must be risked. And here's where it gets unbearable. Free will doesn't just mean you can choose coffee or tea. It means a human being can choose to torture a child. It means someone can look at everything good and beautiful and spit on it. It means the world can become a place of such suffering that God himself seems like a sadist for creating it. Dostoevsky called this the problem of theodicy, but he didn't approach it like a problem to solve. He approached it like a wound that won't heal. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov doesn't ask theoretical questions about suffering. He catalogs real cases. a 5-year-old girl beaten by her parents, a surf boy torn apart by hunting dogs for sport, a baby whose mother smeared its face with excrement for crying at night. And then Ivan asks his brother Alyosha, the believer, the monk, the Christian, is any possible future harmony worth this child's suffering? If eternal paradise required the torture of even one innocent child, would you accept that ticket? Alyosha says quietly, "No, I wouldn't." This is the crisis at the heart of Christian faith, and Dostoevsky refuses to look away. Most theologians try to explain suffering. It's a test. It builds character. We can't understand God's ways. Free will has costs. Dostoevsky says, stop. Those answers are obscene when you're looking at a tortured child. They're philosophical anesthetics meant to numb us to the actual horror of what free will permits. Think about what this means. It means that Christianity, if it's true, contains within itself something absolutely terrifying. God could have made a world where suffering was impossible. He could have made beings who only chose good. The fact that he didn't, that he gave us this awful freedom, means either he's not the God Christians claim, or freedom is so important that even torture and evil don't outweigh its value. Now here's where Dostoevsky's argument becomes explosive. If you're honest about what free will costs, you can't be a comfortable Christian. You can't sing happy songs about God's love without acknowledging that this same God permits atrocities. You can't talk about divine providence without wrestling with the fact that providence apparently includes concentration camps. This isn't about being pessimistic or depressing. It's about being honest. Dostoevsky's Christianity demands that you look directly at evil, not through the lens of theological explanations, but as it actually is. Only then can you decide if faith is still possible. So Dostoevsky argues, through Ivan Karamazov, that there are really only two coherent positions. Either you accept the ticket, you say yes, the future harmony is worth every child's suffering, or you respectfully return your ticket to God. You say, I can't accept a universe built on this foundation, even if it leads to paradise. Most of Ivan's readers assume he's an atheist making a case against God. But here's the twist that makes Dostoevsky brilliant. Ivan isn't an atheist. He says explicitly, it's not that I don't accept God, Alyosha. I just don't accept his world. Ivan believes God exists. He just can't love him. He can't worship a deity who permits this amount of suffering. This is faith's most honest crisis, not disbelief, but moral revulsion at what belief requires you to accept. And here's what makes this so psychologically complex. Ivan's rebellion isn't motivated by selfishness or hatred. It's motivated by compassion. He can't stand the thought of children suffering. He's more morally sensitive, not less, than comfortable believers who explain suffering away with platitudes. This is what makes his atheism, or rather, his rejection of God's world, so powerful. It comes from genuine love for humanity, genuine outrage at injustice. You can't dismiss it as someone wanting to sin without consequences. It's the opposite. Someone who takes morality so seriously that he can't reconcile it with the world as it is. Think about what this means for our contemporary arguments about faith. Most atheist critiques focus on evidence. There's no proof God exists. Ivan goes deeper. Even if God exists, even if we have proof, we might be morally obligated to reject him if his governance of reality permits such horrors. This is a far more challenging position. You can respond to evidential atheism with apologetics, with cosmological arguments, with historical evidence for resurrection. But how do you respond to moral atheism? To someone who says, I see that you might be right about God's existence, but I can't worship a God who runs the universe this way. Dostoevsky doesn't give a direct answer to Ivan. He can't, because Ivan's right about the horror. Children do suffer unbearably. Parents do torture their own kids. Innocent people are destroyed by evil. No amount of theological explanation makes that acceptable. Any God who permits it is, by human standards of morality, guilty. This is the genuine scandal. Not that Christians can't explain suffering. Everyone knows suffering exists. But that Christians claim to worship a God who's both all-powerful and all-loving. While that God allows Auschwitz, allows child cancer, allows rape, allows all the horrors that make sensitive people question whether life is worth living. So what's Dostoevsky's response? It comes in layers. First, through Father Zosima's teachings about active love. Second, through the Grand Inquisitor story. Third, through the actual suffering and transformation of characters in the novel. He's not arguing philosophically. He's demonstrating existentially. He's saying, I can't explain this rationally, but I can show you people who faced this horror and still chose faith, and here's what that faith looked like in practice. Now, before you think Dostoevsky is destroying Christianity, watch what he does next. He has Father Zosima, the elder monk, respond not with arguments, but with a way of life. Zosima doesn't explain suffering away. He doesn't give Ivan a philosophical solution. Instead, he demonstrates something else entirely: active love. Here's the crucial distinction. Rational Christianity tries to make suffering make sense. Dostoevsky's Christianity says suffering won't ever make sense, but love in response to suffering does. You can't explain why a child suffers, but you can be present with that suffering. You can't theodicy your way out of evil, but you can fight evil with concrete acts of compassion. Let me make this concrete with an example from Dostoevsky's own life. In Siberia, in the labor camp, Dostoevsky encountered murderers, rapists, men who'd done things that would make you sick. He also encountered men who shared their last piece of bread, criminals who protected weaker prisoners, monsters who showed flashes of humanity. He realized something that shattered his earlier naive Christianity. Human beings aren't divided into good people and bad people. Every person contains both saint and demon. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. This transforms how Christianity must work. You can't love humanity in the abstract, as Ivan does. That leads to loving an idea, while despising actual people. You have to love specific, flawed, broken individuals, including yourself. This is why Father Zosima teaches active love, not sentimental feelings about humanity, but the concrete, difficult, often frustrating work of loving this person in front of you, right now, despite everything. But here's where the debates begin, and they're fierce. Secular humanists argue that you don't need Christianity for this. You can care for suffering people without believing in God. You can fight injustice without resurrection theology. Why drag Christ into it? Dostoevsky's response, expressed through his characters, is subtle but devastating. He agrees that you can be moral without God. Of course you can. But the question isn't whether you can be moral, it's whether you can sustain it. Ivan Karamazov is brilliant, compassionate, outraged by injustice, and he goes mad. He can't bear the weight of a world without God. His morality has no foundation, no ground, no source. It's a tree with no roots, and eventually it topples. The contemporary critic George Steiner puts it this way: Dostoevsky shows that atheistic morality is like living on capital you inherited but didn't earn. You're spending Christian moral reserves while rejecting their source. For a generation or two, you can maintain ethical behavior. But eventually, without the wellspring, it dries up. Not because atheists are bad people, but because be good to others requires an answer to why. That materialism can't provide. Here's where Dostoevsky's insight becomes practically important, not just theoretically interesting. If freedom is as dangerous as he shows, if human nature is as corrupt as he demonstrates, then Christianity isn't about being nice. It's about transformation at the deepest level. It's about dying to your old self and being reborn into something new. Not metaphorically, literally. This has immediate implications for how we think about moral progress and human nature. Modern secular thought tends to believe humans are basically good, and proper education and social systems will bring that goodness out. Dostoevsky says, "You're dangerously naive. Humans are capable of anything. Give them freedom without transformation, and you'll get Nazis and gulags. Social systems don't change hearts." His character Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment demonstrates this perfectly. Raskolnikov is educated, intelligent, full of compassion for the poor. He's also willing to murder an old woman because his philosophy tells him extraordinary people are above morality. Education didn't save him. Progressive ideas didn't save him. What saves him is Sonia, the prostitute who reads him the story of Lazarus's resurrection. Love and faith accomplish what reason couldn't. But here's the problem that divides interpreters of Dostoevsky. Is he saying faith is irrational? That you have to abandon reason to be Christian? That Christianity is about feeling rather than thinking? Some readers, like Nietzsche, concluded that Dostoevsky's Christianity is emotional and anti-intellectual, that he retreated from philosophy into sentiment. Other readers argue the opposite, that Dostoevsky shows reason is necessary but insufficient. Faith isn't irrational, it's transrational. It deals with dimensions of reality that logic alone can't capture. I think the second reading is correct, and here's why. Look at the brothers Karamazov carefully. Ivan's arguments against God are never refuted rationally. No character gives him a philosophical answer that defeats his logic. But Ivan is still wrong, not because his logic fails, but because his logic is incomplete. He's reasoning about reality while missing the most important feature of reality, the presence of suffering love, embodied in Christ. This brings us to the absolute center of Dostoevsky's Christianity, and it's both simple and shattering. The answer to suffering isn't an explanation, it's Christ's crucifixion. God doesn't explain why evil exists. He descends into it. He suffers with us. He experiences the worst evil can do: torture, betrayal, abandonment, execution, and then he forgives. This is why the Grand Inquisitor section of the brothers Karamazov is the most important passage Dostoevsky ever wrote. Let me walk through it carefully, because everything depends on understanding it. In Ivan's story, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles, heals people, resurrects a child. The Grand Inquisitor, a 90-year-old cardinal, has him arrested. That night, he visits Christ in his cell and delivers a monologue that's one of literature's most devastating critiques of Christianity. The Inquisitor says, "You wanted humans to follow you freely, out of love, not compulsion. But freedom is torture for most people. They can't bear it. They don't want it. They want bread, certainty, and someone to worship. So we've corrected your work. We've taken freedom away and given them what they really need: security, authority, miracle. We love humanity more than you do because we spare them the burden of freedom. Notice what the Inquisitor is saying. He's not a cynic. He genuinely thinks he's more compassionate than Christ. He's seen how humans suffer under the weight of freedom, the anxiety, the wrong choices, the guilt. He's decided that true love means removing freedom's burden, even if it means lying to people about God's will. This is Christianity's eternal temptation: to protect people from the risks of freedom, to create a system where everyone is safe, comfortable, fed, and controlled, where there's no more suffering, but also no more choice, where Christ's teaching is reduced to rules that keep society functioning. And here's the moment that breaks readers open. Christ says nothing the entire time. When the Inquisitor finishes his argument, Christ simply walks over and kisses him on the lips. No rebuttal, no condemnation, just this act of radical love towards someone who's trying to destroy his teaching. The Inquisitor trembles, opens the door, and tells Christ to leave and never come back. Christ walks away into the dark streets. What does the kiss mean? Readers have argued about this for 140 years. Here's what I think Dostoevsky is showing us. The Inquisitor's critique is logically devastating. His compassion is real. His observations about human weakness are accurate. But he's still fundamentally wrong. And not because his reasoning fails, because his love isn't actually love. Real love, Christ's love, risks everything. It gives freedom even knowing freedom will be abused. It refuses to control, manipulate, or coerce, even for good ends. It would rather suffer rejection than remove the possibility of rejection. The kiss is Christ's way of saying several things simultaneously. First, I hear you. I understand your pain. I know you think you're being compassionate. Second, I love you even though you're opposing everything I taught. Third, I won't force you to accept me. That would violate the very freedom I came to give. Fourth, your compassion, though misguided, is still rooted in love, and I honor that. The kiss acknowledges the Inquisitor's genuine suffering over humanity's suffering. The Inquisitor has spent 90 years trying to spare people from the burden of freedom. He's seen how people abuse their freedom, how they hurt themselves and others, how they long for someone to just tell them what to do. His desire to protect them isn't cynical. It's exhausted compassion, but it's still wrong. And here's why, in Dostoevsky's vision. The Inquisitor's compassion is ultimately contempt. He doesn't believe humans are capable of handling freedom. He sees them as children who need to be managed, as sheep who need shepherding, whether they want it or not. He's willing to lie to them, to continue the fiction of Christianity while gutting its actual content, because he thinks they can't handle the truth. They can't handle the freedom Christ offers. They can't handle the responsibility of choosing their own path. They need miracle, mystery, and authority, spectacle, confusion, and control. Christ's kiss rejects this entire framework. It says, "You're wrong about human nature. Yes, people will often choose badly. Yes, freedom is a burden. Yes, many would trade freedom for security. But that doesn't mean they should. Because a human without freedom isn't fully human. They're a domesticated animal, comfortable in their cage, but not alive in the way I intended." This is almost impossible to accept. Every instinct in us wants to say, "That's stupid. If you can prevent suffering, you should, even if it means limiting freedom." Parents feel this about their children. We feel this about people we love. Surely preventing disaster is more loving than allowing terrible choices. Look at how this plays out in practical parenting. You see your teenager about to make a disastrous choice. You could control them, force them to do what's right, prevent the disaster. And sometimes you do, when they're too young to understand consequences. But at some point, you have to let them choose, even knowing they might choose wrong, even knowing they might get hurt. Because if you never let them choose, they never develop judgment. They never learn to be responsible. They never become adults. They remain perpetual children, needing someone else to make their decisions. The Inquisitor wants humanity to remain perpetual children, comfortable, safe, fed, entertained, but never truly free, never truly responsible, never truly grown. Christ wants humanity to grow up, even though the growing pains are excruciating, even though many will make disastrous choices, even though the cost of freedom is measured in suffering, because the alternative, eternal childhood, eternal dependence, eternal control, is a kind of death. It's safety at the cost of personhood. Now here's where this becomes politically explosive. The Inquisitor represents every totalitarian system, whether left or right, religious or secular. Every ideology that says, "We know what's best for you, so we'll make your choices for you." Soviet communism said, "We'll create perfect equality, but you must surrender your freedom to choose." Corporate capitalism says, "We'll give you unlimited choice of products, but not real freedom to organize society differently." Theocratic religion says, "We'll give you absolute truth, but you must surrender your right to question." All of them make the Inquisitors trade security for freedom, certainty for autonomy, comfort for dignity. And here's the disturbing part. The Inquisitor's offer is tempting. Many people would take it. Many people do take it every day. They vote for authoritarian leaders who promise simple solutions. They join movements that offer identity and purpose in exchange for critical thinking. They embrace ideologies that remove the burden of choosing by telling them exactly what to believe and how to live. The Inquisitors write that people crave authority, miracle, and mystery. We want someone to tell us we're on the right side. We want spectacular proof that our beliefs are correct. We want mysteries that can't be questioned, so we never have to doubt. Christ refuses to provide any of that. No miracles on demand. This generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. No political power. My kingdom is not of this world. No simple rules. Instead, impossible standards like, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect," and "Love your enemies." He makes it harder, not easier. He increases the burden, not decreases it. Why? Because only hard things, things that require everything from you, can transform you. Easy religion produces comfortable believers who've never been tested. Hard religion produces either apostates or saints, people who either can't bear the weight and leave, or bear the weight and are transfigured by it. Dostoevsky says, no, not ultimately, because a controlled person isn't a person, they're a puppet. Safety purchased at the cost of freedom is a cage, not salvation. The Inquisitor wants to turn humanity into a well-fed, well-managed herd. Christ wants genuine persons, which means risking everything. But here's where it gets even more complex. the Inquisitor says something chilling. We are not with you, but with him. With Satan. He's admitting that the institutional church has betrayed Christ's teaching. That organized religion, in its desire to manage human freedom, has aligned with the devil's promise at the temptation in the wilderness. Give people bread, and they'll follow you. This is Dostoevsky's most radical claim, and it alienated both atheists and church authorities. He's saying that the church itself, when it prioritizes control over freedom, becomes anti-Christian, that you can invoke Christ's name while doing Satan's work. That religion without freedom is tyranny, no matter how benevolent its intentions. Think about what this means for contemporary Christianity. How many churches reduce faith to following rules? How many promise prosperity if you believe hard enough? How many leaders claim authority to tell you exactly how to live? Dostoevsky would say, they're all repeating the Inquisitor's mistake, trying to remove the scandal of freedom because freedom is too costly, too dangerous, too likely to result in people choosing wrong. But Christ's kiss says something else. It says, even the Inquisitor, even the betrayer of freedom, even the false teacher is loved. The kiss doesn't mean you're right. It means I see you, I know you, and I love you anyway. This is the unbearable lightness of Christian love. It's not based on agreement, correctness, or worthiness. It's gratuitous, excessive, unreasonable. Now here's where modern readers struggle. We want Christianity to make sense. We want it to be fair, logical, just. But Dostoevsky shows a Christ who forgives the unforgivable, who loves the unlovable, who saves the unsavable. This violates our sense of justice. It should. That's the point. Grace isn't fair. If it were fair, it wouldn't be grace. It'd be payment. Christian love, in Dostoevsky's vision, is almost offensive. It treats all humans as infinitely valuable, regardless of merit. The murderer and the saint both receive the offer of salvation. This is why Ivan rebels. He wants justice, not mercy. He wants the child torturers punished, not forgiven. He can imagine a system where good is rewarded and evil is punished, but that's not Christianity. Christianity says everyone is guilty, everyone falls short, and everyone is offered redemption anyway. It's either the most beautiful thing in the world or the most unjust, depending on whether you're more focused on what people deserve or what love gives. Let me make this concrete with another example from Dostoevsky's work. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits a brutal double murder. He's guilty, no ambiguity. He deserves punishment by any standard of justice. But Sonia loves him anyway. She doesn't excuse his crime. She doesn't pretend it wasn't evil. She simply refuses to abandon him in his guilt. She tells him to confess, to accept his punishment, but she promises to follow him to Siberia, to wait for him through his sentence, to be there when he's ready to be reborn. This is active love in practice, not sentimental, not enabling, but refusing to write anyone off as beyond redemption. And here's the crucial part. Raskolnikov's transformation doesn't happen through philosophical argument. It happens through suffering his punishment and experiencing Sonia's steadfast love. Truth without love is sterile. Love without truth is empty. But truth combined with love has the power to resurrect the dead. Part 2. The burden of Christ. Why belief is harder than doubt. Now we need to confront something that makes Dostoevsky uncomfortable for many Christians. He never hides his doubts. In his letters, he admits, I am a child of disbelief and doubt, and will be until I die. The thirst for belief that springs from my doubt has been and is a source of the most painful struggle. This isn't a lapse or a failure. It's the constant condition of his faith. Dostoevsky's Christianity isn't about having certainty. It's about choosing belief despite not having certainty. About committing to Christ even while the doubts rage. This makes him almost unique among Christian writers. Most either pretend doubt doesn't exist or treat it as something to overcome and leave behind. Dostoevsky says doubt is permanent, and faith means betting your life on Christ anyway. But why? If doubt is permanent, why not just remain agnostic? Why make the commitment? Here's where Dostoevsky's argument becomes existential rather than evidential. He's not saying you should believe because the arguments work. He's saying you should believe because the alternative is unbearable. Not in a weak way. I need the comfort, but in an ontological way. Without God, without Christ, without resurrection, human life becomes absurd. Not just meaningless, but actively horrifying. Let me explain what he means. If there's no God, then suffering has no purpose. Evil has no answer. Death has no defeat. Everything you love will be destroyed. Every act of courage, every moment of beauty, every sacrifice, all pointless in the end. The Nazis and the saints both end up as dust. Torture and love both disappear into void. Now, this doesn't prove God exists. Dostoevsky knows that. But it shows what's at stake in the question. It's not academic. It's about whether reality is fundamentally tragic or fundamentally redemptive. Here's where atheist readers push back hard. They say, so you believe in God because you can't handle reality? That's wishful thinking, not truth. And they've got a point. Dostoevsky would agree with them halfway. Yes, the desire for God doesn't prove God exists. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. But here's his subtle response. The fact that we desire meaning, that we crave justice, that we need love, that we sense something transcendent, might itself be evidence. Not proof, but a clue. He puts it this way, through Dmitry Karamazov. God torments me. That's the only thing that torments me. What does that mean? It means the question of God won't leave you alone. You can't think your way out of it. You can't ignore it. You can't be neutral. The universe seems to demand a response to the question of whether it means something. And that demand itself suggests there's something beyond the purely material. But here's what separates Dostoevsky from simplistic apologetics. He never claims this settles the question. He shows characters who choose atheism for good reasons, like Ivan. He shows characters who believe for bad reasons, like hypocritical monks. He refuses to make it easy. The contemporary philosopher William James called this the will to believe. He argued that for some questions, you can't wait for sufficient evidence because the choice itself is existentially urgent. Choosing to suspend judgment is itself a choice with consequences. Dostoevsky would agree, but he'd add that choosing belief is harder than choosing doubt, because belief requires more from you. Think about what belief demands. If you really believe Christ rose from the dead, then everything changes. You can't live for yourself anymore. You have to forgive people who've destroyed you. You have to love your enemies. You have to see every person as bearing God's image. You have to take suffering seriously while also trusting. It's not the final word. That's exhausting. Doubt is easier. Atheism is easier. Not because the intellectual case is stronger, but because the ethical demands are lower. Let me unpack this more carefully, because it's counterintuitive. We usually think atheism is the intellectually hard position. You have to overcome childhood conditioning, social pressure, fear of hell. And that's true for some people. But existentially, atheism is often the easier choice because it lowers the stakes. If atheism is true, then your obligations are limited. Be decent to people, contribute to society, enjoy life where you can, and that's it. No cosmic accountability. No need to love enemies. Just avoid them. No need to forgive the unforgivable. Just pursue justice and move on. No need to sacrifice your interest for strangers. Just be reasonably charitable, and you're good. But if Christianity is true, then you're called to something vastly more demanding. You're called to love people who hate you. Not just tolerate them, love them. Actively wish them well. Pray for them. Help them if you can. That's not natural. It goes against every self-protective instinct. Or consider forgiveness. If atheism is true, you can say, "That person wronged me. I'll never trust them again, and I'm right to hold this grudge." Perfectly reasonable. But if Christianity is true, you have to forgive 70 times 7. You have to let go of legitimate grievances. You have to choose reconciliation even when the other person hasn't earned it. Or think about money and possessions. If atheism is true, you can say, "I earned this through my work. I'll enjoy it as I see fit. And as long as I'm not actively harming anyone, I'm fine." But if Christianity is true, then everything you have is a gift from God, held in stewardship, and you're called to radical generosity. Give to everyone who asks. Sell what you have and give to the poor. You cannot serve God and money. These aren't suggestions, they're commands, and they're impossible to fully live out without constantly falling short, feeling guilty, trying again. This is why Dostoevsky has Father Zosima teach that true Christianity is harder than monastery life. Monks can withdraw from the world's corruption. They can live in community with like-minded believers. They can structure their days around prayer and study. They can avoid most temptations just by limiting their exposure. But real believers have to stay in the world, work in the world, love people in the world, while holding to values the world mocks. They have to practice forgiveness in a culture of revenge. They have to value the poor in a culture of success. They have to choose suffering love in a culture of self-protection. They're like secret agents behind enemy lines, trying to represent one kingdom while physically present in another. And here's what makes it even harder. You can't just follow external rules. The Pharisees did that, and Jesus condemned them as whitewashed tombs. Clean outside, dead inside. You have to internalize the values. Your inner life has to match your outer behavior. You can't just refrain from murder. You can't harbor hatred. You can't just avoid adultery. You can't indulge lustful thoughts. You can't just give to charity. You have to give joyfully, not grudgingly. Jesus raised the standard to a level no one can meet. Why? To drive us to dependence on grace. To show us we can't save ourselves through moral effort. We need divine help just to want what we should want, much less to do it. Think about how psychologically demanding this is. Most moral systems focus on behavior. Do this, don't do that, and you're righteous. But Christianity says behavior without proper motivation doesn't count. If you give to charity to be seen as generous, Jesus says you've already received your reward, the admiration of people. You don't get credit with God. If you pray to appear spiritual, same thing. If you fast to show your devotion, same thing. God judges not just your actions, but your heart, your motivations, your secret thoughts that no one else sees. This means you're never done. You can never check the box and say, "I'm good." Even when you do the right thing, you have to examine why you did it. Were you serving God or seeking approval? Were you loving your neighbor or boosting your self-image? Were you genuinely compassionate or just performing compassion? This kind of constant self-examination is exhausting. It's much easier to have a simple ethical code where you either keep the rules or you don't. And as long as you're keeping them, you're fine. But here's the promise that makes the demand bearable. If Christ rose, then death is defeated. If God became human, then matter itself is sacred. If the crucifixion happened, then suffering has been transformed from meaningless tragedy into participation in divine love. These aren't just comforting thoughts. If true, they're the most important truths in the universe. Everything depends on whether they're true, not whether they're helpful, inspiring, or psychologically beneficial. Whether they're true. And if they're true, then no demand is too great, no sacrifice too costly, because you're participating in eternal reality. You're aligning yourself with the fundamental nature of existence, which is love, which is God. This is why Dostoevsky has Father Zosima teach that true Christianity is harder than monastery life. Monks can withdraw from the world's corruption, but real believers have to stay in the world, work in the world, love people in the world, while holding to values the world mocks. They have to practice forgiveness in a culture of revenge. They have to value the poor in a culture of success. They have to choose suffering love in a culture of self-protection. No wonder people prefer either comfortable religion, following rules without transformation, or comfortable atheism, living morally without supernatural demands. Dostoevsky's Christianity is uncomfortable. It demands everything. But here's the promise that makes the demand bearable. If Christ rose, then death is defeated. If God became human, then matter itself is sacred. If the crucifixion happened, then suffering has been transformed from meaningless tragedy into participation in divine love. These aren't just comforting thoughts. If true, they're the most important truths in the universe. Everything depends on whether they're true, not whether they're helpful, inspiring, or psychologically beneficial, whether they're true. And here's where Dostoevsky becomes most Russian Orthodox in his thinking. Western Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, tends to approach faith rationally. Start with proofs for God, establish Christ's divinity, derive ethical principles, apply them to life. Dostoevsky says that's backward. You don't reason your way to Christ. You encounter him. Faith isn't a conclusion. It's a relationship. It's not about having the right ideas. It's about being known by and knowing the person of Jesus. This shows up most clearly in Alyosha's character. He doesn't have sophisticated philosophical arguments. He's not intellectually brilliant like Ivan, but he's present. He listens. He loves concretely. He sees Christ in people, especially suffering people. His faith isn't abstract theology. It's lived encounter. When Father Zosima dies and his body begins to smell, Orthodox believers expected saints' bodies to be incorrupt. Alyosha's faith wavers, not because a doctrine failed, but because his beloved elder seems abandoned by God. He recovers his faith not through argument, but through mystical experience, a vision of Cana of Galilee where Zosima appears transfigured, participating in Christ's joy. Now, secular readers see this as Dostoevsky retreating into mysticism when rational faith fails. But I think that misses what he's showing. Rational faith hadn't failed Alyosha. He'd never had it. His faith was always relational, always rooted in love for his elder and love from his elder. When that anchor seemed to fail, he experienced crisis, and he recovered through encountering the risen Christ in vision. That's not irrational. It's supra-rational. It addresses dimensions of human experience that logic alone can't touch. But here's the crucial question this raises. Can everyone have mystical experiences? And if not, is Dostoevsky's Christianity only for spiritual elites? This is actually one of the problems he wrestles with. Not everyone is Alyosha. Most people are like Dmitri, passionate, impulsive, sensual, struggling, or like Ivan, intellectual, doubting, morally serious, but unable to believe. What does Christianity offer them? Dostoevsky's answer is surprising. He says Christianity is especially for the broken, the sinners, the strugglers, not for those who have it all figured out. Look at his gallery of believers. Father Zosima had a wild youth before conversion. Dmitri is practically pagan in his appetites. Sonia is a prostitute. The actual believer who's never struggled, Father Ferapont, is shown as a harsh, judgmental fanatic. Dostoevsky is saying that true faith comes through brokenness, not through purity. You don't qualify for grace by being good. You qualify by knowing you're not. This is deeply Protestant in one sense. Salvation by grace through faith, not works. But it's deeply Orthodox in another sense. Theosis, becoming like God, happens through synergy between divine grace and human response. You can't save yourself, but you have to accept salvation. You can't transform yourself, but you have to cooperate with transformation. It's neither pure gift nor pure merit. It's a dance between divine initiative and human response. Part 3. The Genealogy of Nihilism, How the Death of God Births Monsters. Now we turn to what makes Dostoevsky prophetic. He saw, before almost anyone, where atheism would lead. Not just personal atheism, principled philosophical atheism as a cultural movement. He predicted the 20th century's horrors 50 years before they happened. In Notes from Underground, he shows how materialist philosophy produces the underground man, isolated, spiteful, unable to love or be loved. In Crime and Punishment, he shows how utilitarian ethics produce Raskolnikov, willing to murder for the greater good. In Demons, or the Possessed, he shows how revolutionary ideologies produce Stavrogin and Pyotr Verkovensky, nihilists who destroy because destruction is the only meaning left when God is dead. Here's his argument, and it's worth following carefully because it's not a straw man. When Nietzsche proclaimed God is dead, he didn't mean it as celebration. He meant it as diagnosis and warning. If God is dead, then objective morality is dead. If objective morality is dead, then anything is permitted, as even Karamazov realizes. If anything is permitted, then what stops you from doing anything you want? Only power, social pressure, and personal preference, none of which are binding in any ultimate sense. Now, modern secular thinkers respond, that's ridiculous. We have empathy, reason, social contracts. We don't need God to be moral. And for many individuals, that's true. Most atheists are good people. But Dostoevsky isn't talking about individuals. He's talking about societies, ideologies, movements. When a society collectively abandons transcendent values, what fills the vacuum? His answer, demonstrated through demons, is ideology. Specifically, totalitarian ideology that claims to create heaven on earth through human effort. The character Shigalyov in Demons proposes a system where perfect equality is achieved by dividing humanity into two groups, 1/10 who rule and 9/10 who lose all individuality and become like a herd. He admits this requires unlimited despotism, but he argues it's the only logical conclusion of atheistic humanism. If there's no transcendent value to human beings, then they're just biological machines to be organized efficiently. Perfect equality means eliminating what makes people different: their freedom, their individuality, their unpredictability. Before you dismiss this as absurd, look at what actually happened. Soviet communism, Maoist China, Nazi Germany, Pol Pot's Cambodia. Every major atheistic regime of the 20th century produced exactly what Dostoevsky predicted: systems that claim to perfect humanity while treating humans as disposable. Millions killed not out of hatred, but out of ideology. Not because leaders were uniquely evil, but because their worldview made genocide logical. Let me be more specific. Stalin didn't kill millions because he was a sadist. He killed them because he believed history, with a capital H, was moving toward communist paradise, and anyone who hindered that movement was expendable. The kulaks weren't killed because they were hated. They were killed because they represented an obstacle to collectivization, which was necessary for the socialist future. It was completely rational within the framework of dialectical materialism. If there's no God, no eternal soul, no transcendent value to individuals, then people are just means to ends. And if the end is glorious enough, perfect equality, elimination of suffering, paradise on earth, then any means becomes justified. Dostoevsky saw this coming before Karl Marx's ideas had fully developed, before Lenin, before Stalin. He saw it because he understood that once you remove God as the ground of human value, you're left with whatever ideology fills the vacuum. And ideologies are hungry gods. They demand sacrifice. They promise paradise, but deliver hell. Because they're not constrained by anything beyond human will and human power. Now here's where the argument gets uncomfortable for everyone. Dostoevsky isn't saying atheists want this. He's saying atheism's logic leads here when pushed to its conclusion. Most atheists stop short. They maintain Christian moral intuitions without their foundation. They oppose totalitarianism, defend human rights, affirm human dignity. But on what basis? Not on materialism, which sees humans as just complex animals. Not on utilitarianism, which would justify killing some to benefit others. Not on evolutionary psychology, which explains morality as survival mechanism, not objective truth. Think about the arguments contemporary atheists make for morality. Sam Harris argues that science can determine human values through understanding well-being. But why should we value well-being? Because we prefer pleasure to pain? Then why not maximize your own well-being at others' expense if you can get away with it? Harris has to smuggle in the assumption that all human well-being matters equally, but that's precisely what needs justification. Why does it matter equally? Not because science says so. Science is descriptive, not prescriptive. It can tell you what promotes well-being, but not whether you should promote it. Richard Dawkins argues that we evolved to be moral, that altruism has survival value. Fine, but that explains the origin of moral feelings, not their validity. The fact that evolution gave us moral intuitions doesn't make those intuitions objectively true. evolution also gave us the intuition that the sun revolves around the earth. We had to overcome that intuition to find truth. Similarly, if morality is just evolutionary programming, we're not obligated to follow it. We could recognize it as a useful fiction and override it when convenient. Nothing in evolutionary theory says you should follow your evolved instincts rather than your self-interest. Peter Singer argues for preference utilitarianism. We should maximize preference satisfaction. But whose preferences count? Singer bites the bullet and says some humans, severely disabled infants, count less than some animals, adult chimpanzees, based on cognitive capacity. This is logically consistent with utilitarianism, but horrifying morally. It's exactly what Dostoevsky predicted. Once you lose the foundation that all human life is sacred because it bears God's image, you start making calculations about whose life is worth living. You start down the road to eugenics, euthanasia of the unfit, and worse. The contemporary philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre makes a similar argument about modern moral discourse. He says we're using moral language inherited from Christianity, words like rights, dignity, justice, but we've abandoned the framework that made those words meaningful. It's like continuing to argue in chess terms after you've thrown away the board in pieces. The words still sound important, but they've lost their reference points. When someone says human rights, what makes that true? If humans are just clever apes, products of blind evolutionary forces, temporary arrangements of atoms, then rights is just a word we use to describe our preferences. It has no more objective reality than the divine right of kings. Dostoevsky would add something darker. He'd say that when societies lose their transcendent foundation, they don't remain morally neutral. They become actively destructive. Because humans need meaning, we can't live in nihilism. We need something larger than ourselves to live for. If we can't have God, we'll create false gods to worship. The nation, the party, the race, progress, history, humanity. And those gods demand sacrifice. Literal human sacrifice. Not metaphorical, not occasional, but systematic and massive. Stalin didn't kill millions accidentally. He killed them as offerings to the god of history, which would vindicate his actions by creating paradise for future generations. Nazi Germany didn't exterminate Jews by accident. They did it as sacrifice to the god of racial purity, which would create the perfect Aryan society. Pol Pot didn't empty the cities by mistake. He did it as offering to the god of year zero, which would erase all corruption and start humanity fresh. These weren't betrayals of atheistic ideology. They were its logical conclusions. If there's no God, then there's no eternal standard of right and wrong. If there's no eternal standard, then whoever has power determines what's right. If power determines right, then creating the future you want justifies any present atrocity. This is the slide Dostoevsky traced. From loss of faith to loss of objective morality to utilitarian calculation to mass murder in service of ideology. And before anyone says, but religious societies also commit atrocities, let's be clear about the distinction Dostoevsky makes. When Christians launched crusades, burned heretics, or enslaved people, they were violating Christ's explicit teaching. Jesus said, "Love your enemies. Turn the other cheek. Blessed are the merciful." When Christians do violence, they're hypocrites, acting against their own stated principles. You can condemn them using Christianity's own standards. But when Stalin killed millions, he wasn't violating Marxist ideology. he was implementing it. When Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, he wasn't betraying communism, he was purifying it. When Pol Pot emptied the cities, he wasn't contradicting his principles, he was following them consistently. This is the crucial difference. Christianity has internal resources to critique its own failures. The prophets condemned Israel's injustice. Jesus opposed the religious authorities. The saints called for reform. The Bible itself contains self-criticism, God judging his own people for their failures. But materialist atheism has no internal resources to say genocide is objectively wrong. It can say genocide is inefficient, or socially harmful, or personally distasteful, but not that it's evil in any ultimate sense, because evil requires a transcendent standard. Without that standard, atrocity is just rearranging atoms. One arrangement of atoms isn't more right than another. They're morally equivalent, just different configurations of matter. You might say, but I'm an atheist, and I know genocide is wrong. Of course you do. Dostoevsky would say that proves his point. You know genocide is wrong because you're still operating with Christian moral intuitions, even though you've rejected their foundation. You're like someone living in a house after removing its foundation. The house is still standing, for now, but it's structurally unsound. Eventually, it will collapse. Maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not in your children's lifetime, but eventually. Because moral intuitions, without foundations, are capital you inherited, but didn't earn. You can spend it, but when it runs out, what replenishes it? This is the deepest horror in Dostoevsky's vision. Evil doesn't come primarily from bad people doing bad things. It comes from good people doing what they sincerely believe is good, but with a twisted understanding of what good means. The Grand Inquisitor thinks he's more compassionate than Christ. Raskolnikov thinks he's like Napoleon, beyond conventional morality. The revolutionaries and demons think they're liberating humanity. They're all motivated by the desire to do good, but without God, good becomes whatever serves your ideology. Now let's be fair to atheist responses. Many argue that religious societies have also committed atrocities. The Crusades, the Inquisition, religious wars. Absolutely true. Dostoevsky wouldn't deny it, but he'd say those were betrayals of Christianity, not fulfillments of it. When Christians kill in Christ's name, they violate Christ's explicit teaching to love enemies. When communists killed in Stalin's name, they were following the logic of materialist ideology consistently. Here's the distinction. Christianity has internal resources to critique its own failures. Christ's teaching, the prophets' condemnations of injustice, the call to love enemies. But materialist atheism has no internal resources to say genocide is objectively wrong. It can say genocide is inefficient, or socially harmful, or personally distasteful. But not that it's evil in any ultimate sense, because evil requires a transcendent standard. Without that standard, atrocity is just rearranging atoms. This is why Dostoevsky insisted that the question of God is the question. Not one interesting question among many, but the question that determines everything else. If God exists, then humans have infinite value. Morality is objective, suffering can be redemptive, and history is going somewhere. If God doesn't exist, then humans are cosmic accidents. Morality is preference, suffering is meaningless, and history is sound and fury signifying nothing. You can't be neutral on this. Even claiming neutrality is a choice with consequences. If you live as if God doesn't exist, you're functionally atheist, even if you claim agnosticism. And if you live as if God does exist, you're functionally Christian, even if you harbor doubts. Dostoevsky respected honest atheism more than lukewarm Christianity. At least the atheist takes the stakes seriously. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. Dostoevsky shows, through his characters, that atheism is almost impossible to sustain existentially, not intellectually. Intellectually, you can be atheist. But existentially, in your lived experience, you keep acting as if meaning exists, as if morality is binding, as if love matters, as if you have value. Even Karamazov, the intellectual atheist, is tormented by his own philosophy. He can't live consistently with what he claims to believe. When he realizes his ideas contributed to his father's murder, he goes mad. Not because his logic failed, because living out his logic is unbearable. Kirillov, in Demons, is similar. He decides to kill himself to prove man is God, that we create meaning through will. But even his suicide note reveals he's seeking meaning beyond himself. He can't escape the human need for transcendence. This is Dostoevsky's psychological insight. Humans are hardwired for meaning, for transcendence, for the absolute. You can intellectually deny God, but you can't emotionally and existentially live as if nothing matters. You'll create substitute meanings: career, pleasure, relationships, politics. But those substitutes can't bear the weight of ultimate meaning. They collapse under scrutiny, and when they collapse, you face the void, and the void is unendurable. So here's the existential choice Dostoevsky presents. You can admit that you need God, that meaning requires transcendence, that your deepest intuitions point to something beyond matter. Or you can maintain your atheism and either become a monster, acting consistently with everything is permitted, or go mad, unable to bear the implications of meaninglessness. There's no comfortable middle ground where you're atheist but maintain Christian morality and meaning. That's borrowing capital without earning it, and eventually it runs out. Now, before this sounds too triumphalist, remember that Dostoevsky never says Christian faith is easy, or that it solves everything. Alyosha still suffers. Sonia still endures degradation. Father Zosima still dies painfully, and his body still smells. Christianity doesn't remove suffering. It transforms what suffering means. It doesn't answer why evil exists. It shows God participating in the suffering that evil causes. This is a crucial distinction. Atheism can't explain suffering. It can only say it happens. It's terrible, and then you die. Christianity can't explain suffering either, but it says Christ entered into suffering, defeated it through resurrection, and offers you participation in that victory. The explanation isn't philosophical, it's personal. God's answer to Job isn't an argument. It's, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And then, in the incarnation, here I am, suffering with you. Part 4. The Karamazov question. Can you love your neighbor as Christ loves? Now, we arrive at the heart of Dostoevsky's spiritual vision, the question of love. Not romantic love, not friendship, but agape, self-giving love that seeks the good of the other, regardless of cost. This is Christianity's most radical claim and most impossible demand. You must love your enemies. You must forgive 70 times 7. You must give to everyone who asks. You must turn the other cheek. You must lose your life to find it. No other religious or philosophical system makes demands this extreme. And here's what makes it worse. You're not allowed to just follow the rules externally. The inner disposition must match the outer action. You can't just refrain from murder. You can't hate. You can't just avoid adultery. You can't lust. Jesus raises the bar so high that everyone fails constantly. So what's the point? If the standard is perfection and everyone fails, isn't Christianity just a recipe for guilt and shame? This is where Dostoevsky's insight into grace becomes essential. The point isn't that you achieve perfection. The point is that you recognize your need for mercy, extend that mercy to others, and cooperate with God's transforming work in you. This is why Father Zosima emphasizes that everyone is responsible for everyone. Not because you can save everyone, but because recognizing your solidarity with all humans, including sinners, including enemies, is the beginning of love. Here's the passage that captures this. Zosima says, "Brothers, have no fear of men's sin. Love a man even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love, and is the highest love on earth. Love all of God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things." This sounds like mystical poetry, but it's actually rigorous theology. If Christ is the Logos through whom all things were made, then everything that exists reflects him in some way. To love creation is to love Christ's handiwork. To love humans, even in their sin, is to see that Christ died for them, which means they have infinite value despite their corruption. You're not loving the sin. You're loving the person whose nature sin has distorted. But how? How do you actually love someone who's hurt you, who's evil, who represents everything you oppose? Dostoevsky doesn't give a technique or method. He shows it embodied in characters like Sonia and Alyosha. Sonia loves Raskolnikov by refusing to abandon him, by reading him scripture, by following him to Siberia. She doesn't fix him. She's present with him in his guilt and suffering until he's ready to change. Alyosha loves his brothers by listening to them, by taking their struggles seriously, by seeing the good in them, even when they can't see it themselves. This is active love, not a feeling you conjure, but actions you take. You can't make yourself feel warm toward your enemy, but you can pray for them. You can refuse to wish them harm. You can look for opportunities to do them good. And Dostoevsky's psychology suggests that if you consistently act in love, the feeling eventually follows. Not always, not quickly, but gradually, because actions shape character, and character shapes feelings. But here's the hardest question. What if the person you're supposed to love is Hitler, Stalin, a child rapist? Does Christian love mean excusing evil? Dostoevsky says absolutely not. Love can include judgment. Love can include justice. Love can even include punishment, but it can never include dehumanization. You must judge the act while recognizing that the actor remains a human being made in God's image, however defaced that image is. You must pursue justice while hoping for repentance. You must protect victims while not writing off perpetrators as monsters beyond redemption. This is almost impossible to hold in balance. Our instinct is either to excuse evil, that's not real love, it's enabling, or to dehumanize evildoers. That's not real justice, it's revenge. Christian love requires seeing clearly how bad the evil is, while simultaneously seeing that Christ died for this person too. It requires protecting the innocent while not damning the guilty. It requires punishment that aims at redemption, not just retribution. Let me make this concrete with an example that Dostoevsky himself witnessed. In the Siberian labor camp, there was a man named Petrov who'd murdered multiple people. Dostoevsky describes him as having no conscience, no remorse, utterly cold and calculating. By any measure, a monster. But Dostoevsky noticed something. Petrov showed kindness to a sick prisoner. Small kindness, nothing dramatic, just bringing him water, protecting him from other inmates. And Dostoevsky realized that even in the worst human being, even in someone who seems irredeemably evil, there's still a spark of humanity. Still, the image of God, however buried under layers of corruption. This doesn't excuse Petrov's crimes, doesn't mean he shouldn't be punished, doesn't mean his victim's suffering doesn't matter, but it means he's not beyond redemption. Christ died for Petrov too. And if Christ died for him, then writing him off as a monster is denying Christ's sacrifice. It's saying, Jesus, you were wrong about this one. Your love isn't sufficient for him. Your resurrection can't reach him. That's a theological claim Christians can't make without contradicting their faith. But how do you actually do this? How do you love someone who's committed unspeakable evil? Dostoevsky shows it through characters like Father Zosima. Zosima's technique is to see Christ in every person, not metaphorically, literally. He believes that Christ is present in everyone, even when they're actively sinning, even when they're denying him. So when he looks at a murderer, he sees Christ crucified in that person. When he looks at a prostitute, he sees Christ suffering in her degradation. When he looks at an atheist, he sees Christ hidden, obscured, denied, but still present. This is mystical theology, becoming practical psychology. If you see Christ in everyone, you can't hate anyone. You might hate their sin, might oppose their actions, might work to stop their evil, but you can't wish them damned. You can't write them off. You can't stop hoping for their redemption. Because to do so would be to give up on Christ's presence in them. And if Christ is present in the worst person you can imagine, then no one is beyond hope. The contemporary philosopher Miroslav Volf, writing about forgiving during the Yugoslavia wars, puts it this way: forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the wrong didn't happen. It means refusing to let the wrong have the final word. It means saying, you did this evil thing. I name it as evil. I won't excuse it. I won't minimize it. And I choose not to be defined by it, or to define you only by it. That's extraordinarily difficult. And Volf admits he couldn't do it for years after his own suffering. He struggled with nightmares, with rage, with the desire for revenge. But he argues it's the only way to break cycles of violence and revenge. Dostoevsky would agree, and he'd add something crucial. You can't do this on your own. You need grace. You need Christ's love flowing through you, because your natural capacity for love is too weak and too conditional. This is where orthodox theology of theosis becomes important. You're not manufacturing love from your own resources. You're participating in Christ's love. You're allowing his love to work through you, which means you have to stay connected to him through prayer, scripture, sacrament, community. Think about what this means practically. If someone has hurt you deeply, your natural reaction is hatred, desire for revenge, at minimum, wanting them to suffer as you've suffered. That's human. That's normal. Christianity doesn't deny those feelings, but it says those feelings can't be the final word. You have to pray for your enemy, even when you don't feel like it. You have to wish good for them, even when every fiber of your being wants them destroyed. You have to look for opportunities to help them, even when helping them feels like betraying yourself and your own wounds. This sounds psychologically damaging, like you're suppressing legitimate rage, enabling abuse, setting yourself up to be hurt again. And it would be damaging if you did it in your own strength, from your own resources. But the Christian claim is that grace transforms the process. When you pray for your enemy, you're not pretending they didn't hurt you. You're asking God to change them, which is actually the best thing that could happen for everyone, including you. When you wish good for them, you're not excusing their evil. You're hoping they'll repent and become someone who wouldn't do such things anymore. When you help them, you're not being a doormat. You're acting as Christ acted, loving even when the love isn't returned. But here's the crucial boundary. Christian love doesn't mean tolerating ongoing abuse. It doesn't mean staying in dangerous relationships. It doesn't mean letting someone keep hurting you or others. Protection of the innocent is itself an act of love, both for the victims and, paradoxically, for the abuser, who's destroying himself through his evil. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for an abuser is stop them, set firm boundaries, remove their opportunity to keep sinning, even pursue prosecution if needed, not out of revenge, but out of love. Love for their victims, love for society, and ultimately love for them, because continuing in evil destroys them spiritually. This is the balance Dostoevsky shows. Sonia loves Raskolnikov, but tells him he must confess. She doesn't say, "Oh, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. You're fundamentally good." She says, "You've killed 2 people. You're guilty. You need to face your guilt, accept your punishment, and let God transform you." That's real love. Seeing clearly, naming evil as evil, but still refusing to abandon the person to their guilt. She goes with him to Siberia. She waits for him. She's there when he's finally ready to change. But she doesn't enable his denial or excuse his crime. This is what makes Christianity's ethics so difficult and so beautiful. Easy ethics says either forgive everything and let bygones be bygones, which enables evil, or punish the evildoer and write them off, which denies redemption. Christian ethics says, name the evil clearly, pursue justice firmly, protect the innocent vigorously, and still hope for the perpetrator's redemption ultimately. Hold all 4 simultaneously. Don't collapse into easy forgiveness that ignores victims. Don't collapse into harsh judgment that denies grace. Stand in the tension of justice and mercy, truth and love, accountability and forgiveness. This is why Dostoevsky insists that Christianity is harder than any other path. It would be easier to be a vengeful person who just hates enemies. At least that's emotionally consistent. It would be easier to be a soft person who just excuses everything. At least that's psychologically comfortable. But to see evil clearly, to feel appropriate rage at it, to work against it actively, and simultaneously to love the evildoer and hope for their transformation, that's superhuman, which is exactly the point. It requires divine grace precisely because it's beyond human nature. But this raises an uncomfortable question for modern readers. Is Dostoevsky saying non-Christians can't really love? That atheists can't be moral? That's not quite it. He's saying that the ultimate ground of love is God, and that Christ perfectly embodies that love. Can atheists love their children? Of course. Can they be compassionate? Absolutely. But can they sustain sacrificial love for enemies, for the undeserving, for those who offer nothing in return? Can they forgive the unforgivable? On their own resources, Dostoevsky doubts it, because that level of love requires grace, and grace requires a giver. This gets back to the argument about borrowed capital. You can love based on Christian moral intuition without believing Christian theology for a while. But when tested severely, when called to love beyond natural capacity, what sustains you? Not duty, because you'll resent the burden. Not empathy, because it runs out when dealing with enemies. Not self-interest, because there's no benefit. Only grace. Unearned, undeserved love that keeps flowing even when you're empty. Now let me address what troubles many modern readers. Doesn't this make ethics dependent on belief? Doesn't it mean morality is subjective if it requires God? Dostoevsky would say you have the causation backward. Morality isn't subjective because it requires God. Morality is objective because God exists. Without God, morality would be subjective, just human preference. With God, morality is grounded in ultimate reality. The fact that you can't generate objective morality from atheism doesn't make morality subjective. It makes atheism insufficient. This is the famous Euthyphro dilemma, and Dostoevsky has an answer, though it's implicit. The dilemma asks, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If the first, morality is arbitrary. If the second, morality is independent of God. Dostoevsky's answer, shared with classical Christian theology, is neither. Goodness is grounded in God's nature, not his will. God doesn't arbitrarily decide what's good. He is good. His commands reflect his nature. So morality is neither arbitrary nor independent of God. It's the expression of who God is. Part 5. The Brother's Choice. 3 Paths Through Suffering. Let me now show how Dostoevsky synthesizes everything through the 3 brothers Karamazov. Each represents a different response to life's fundamental questions, and together they map the existential terrain we all navigate. Ivan represents the path of reason without faith. He's brilliant, articulate, morally serious. He sees the world's evil with clear eyes and can't reconcile it with a good God. His rejection of faith isn't flippant. It's principled. He would rather be honest about horror than comfort himself with pleasant lies. This is admirable in its way. Ivan won't look away from suffering. He won't explain it away. He demands that reality make sense before he'll accept it. But here's what destroys him. Reason alone can't bear the weight of existence. It can analyze, critique, deconstruct, but it can't provide meaning. Ivan's intellectual honesty becomes spiritual paralysis. He can't believe, but he can't bear not believing. He's caught between 2 impossibilities, accepting a God who permits atrocities, or accepting a universe that's fundamentally absurd. This tension manifests as literal hallucination, his conversations with the devil. Whether the devil is real or a projection of Ivan's fragmenting psyche doesn't matter. The point is that pure rationalism, untempered by faith or love, leads to madness. Dmitri represents the path of passion without discipline. He's sensual, impulsive, life-affirming. He loves beauty, women, pleasure, intensity. He's capable of genuine nobility. He'd give his last kopeck to someone in need. But he's also capable of rage, violence, destruction. He's all appetite and no restraint. Doesn't think through consequences. Lives in the moment. At first, Dmitri seems like the opposite of Ivan. All feeling where Ivan is all thought. But they share a fundamental problem. Both are disconnected from God. Ivan rejects God intellectually. Dmitri ignores God practically, and both suffer for it. But here's where Dmitri's story becomes redemptive. When he's arrested for his father's murder, which he didn't commit though he wanted to, he experiences what he calls the crucifixion of my pride. He realizes that even though he didn't kill his father, he could have. The desire was there. The capacity was there. And that makes him guilty, in some deep sense, even if he's legally innocent of this particular crime. This recognition breaks him open. He accepts his punishment, not as judicial error, but as cosmic justice. He's being punished for who he is, not just what he did. And paradoxically, this acceptance is the beginning of his transformation. Dmitri says something profound. I accept suffering. Not I understand suffering, or suffering is justified, but I accept it. This is Dostoevsky's answer to Ivan's rebellion. You can't make suffering make sense, but you can choose to bear it, to let it transform you, to unite it with Christ's suffering on the cross. Dmitri won't escape to America, though he could. He'll go to Siberia, serve his sentence, and come out a new man. This is kenosis, self-emptying that creates space for God. And then there's Alyosha, the youngest brother. He represents the path of faith with love. He's not naive. He's seen evil. He's heard Ivan's arguments. He's experienced doubt when his beloved elder dies. But he chooses faith anyway. Not blind faith, but faith as commitment. He trusts that reality is ultimately benevolent, that suffering can be redemptive, that love is the deepest truth. Why does he choose this? Not because he has better arguments than Ivan. He doesn't argue much at all. But because he's experienced love. Father Zosima loved him, showed him what active love looks like. That experience grounds his faith more firmly than any philosophical proof could. Alyosha is also Dostoevsky's vision of what Christianity should produce. Not a monk who withdraws from the world, but someone who engages with the world while maintaining spiritual centeredness. Alyosha leaves the monastery. He involves himself with his family's messy conflicts. He tries to help everyone, his brothers, local children, even tangentially related characters. He doesn't always succeed, but he's consistently present, consistently loving, consistently seeing the image of God in people. Here's what the three brothers together show us. Intellect alone, Ivan, leads to despair. Passion alone, Dmitri, leads to destruction. But faith combined with love, Alyosha, creates the possibility of genuine human flourishing. Not easy flourishing. Alyosha's life isn't comfortable or simple, but meaningful flourishing, the sense that you're participating in something larger than yourself, something eternal, something worth the cost. Now, Dostoevsky never finished the second volume where Alyosha's story would presumably continue. We don't see him tested the way Ivan and Dmitri are tested. Some readers see this as a weakness. Alyosha remains somewhat idealized. But I think Dostoevsky's death before completing the work is itself meaningful. It shows that the life of faith is always incomplete, always in progress. Alyosha isn't a finished saint. He's a developing believer. And that's more honest than showing him is perfect and untested. The three brothers also represent three stages many people go through. You might start as Dmitri, passionate, pleasure-seeking, not thinking deeply about ultimate questions. Then something makes you wake up, become self-aware, start questioning. You become Ivan, analytical, troubled, unable to accept easy answers. And if you're fortunate, through suffering and love, you become Alyosha, maintaining intellectual honesty while choosing faith, active in the world while rooted in prayer. But here's the key insight. You don't leave the other brothers behind. Even as Alyosha, you still have Ivan's doubts and Dmitri's passions. The three brothers aren't just three different people. they're three dimensions of every human soul. We all have the doubting intellect, the passionate appetite, and the believing heart. Christian maturity isn't eliminating the first two. It's integrating all three with the third as the organizing principle. Part 6. Resurrection and Renewal. Why Dostoevsky's Christianity ends in hope. Now we come to the question that determines whether Dostoevsky's vision is ultimately tragic or redemptive. Does anyone actually change? Can the guilty be forgiven? Can the broken be healed? Or is everyone trapped in their nature, acting out predetermined patterns until death? Dostoevsky's answer is the resurrection, not as theological doctrine, but as psychological and spiritual reality. People can be reborn, not through their own efforts. Raskolnikov can't think his way out of guilt. Dmitri can't will himself to righteousness. Ivan can't reason himself to peace. But through suffering accepted, through love received, through grace encountered, transformation becomes possible. Look at how crime and punishment ends. After Raskolnikov confesses and is sent to Siberia, he remains hardened for most of his sentence. Prison doesn't automatically rehabilitate him. Suffering doesn't automatically purify him. But Sonia is there, visiting when she can, writing letters, loving him steadfastly. And slowly, imperceptibly, he softens. The novel ends with him picking up the gospel Sonia left him, not with his conversion fully accomplished, but with the door to renewal finally opening. This is crucially important. Dostoevsky doesn't give us cheap grace or instant transformation. He shows that renewal is a process, often a long one. Suffering can prepare you for grace, but it doesn't automatically deliver it. Love can create the conditions for change, but it doesn't force it. You have to choose, moment by moment, to move toward life rather than death. And even then, progress is slow, setbacks are frequent, and completion comes only in God's time, often beyond this life. Look more carefully at Raskolnikov's transformation. For most of his time in Siberia, he's still in denial. He's technically serving his sentence, but internally, he's still justifying his crime. He tells himself he was caught due to bad luck, not because murder is wrong. He views other prisoners with contempt. They're real criminals. But he was just unlucky in his philosophical experiment. He's like many people in therapy who show up physically, but resist change internally, going through the motions without actual transformation. What breaks through this resistance? Not argument. Sonia doesn't debate him, not even religious teaching directly. Though she reads him scripture, he initially hears words without meaning. What changes him is her presence. She keeps showing up, week after week, month after month. She doesn't give up on him even when he gives her nothing back. No gratitude, no affection, no sign that her devotion matters to him. She loves him unconditionally, and that unconditional love slowly erodes his defenses. Think about what this means. Transformation doesn't come through having the right ideas. Raskolnikov's ideas were always his problem. His theory that extraordinary men are beyond conventional morality. More ideas won't fix an idea problem. What transforms him is experiencing a love that doesn't fit any category his philosophy recognizes. Sonia's love for him isn't explicable by self-interest, evolutionary advantage, or utilitarian calculation. It's gratuitous, excessive, unreasonable. And that very unreasonableness points beyond materialism to something transcendent. This is why Dostoevsky emphasizes the resurrection of Lazarus story that Sonia reads to Raskolnikov. Lazarus was dead, not sick, not dying, but actually dead and starting to decompose. No natural process could restore him, but Christ called him back to life. That's what needs to happen to Raskolnikov, to all of us. We're not just morally sick, we're spiritually dead. We can't heal ourselves through effort or education or therapy. We need resurrection, which only God can provide. But notice the cooperation required. Lazarus had to come out of the tomb when called. Christ didn't drag him out. He called, and Lazarus responded. That's the synergy Orthodox theology emphasizes. God's grace is necessary, but human response is also necessary. You can't save yourself, but you have to accept being saved. You can't transform yourself, but you have to cooperate with transformation. It's neither pure gift, no human effort required, nor pure merit, earned through good works. It's a dance between divine initiative and human response. Here's what the three brothers together show us. Intellect alone, Ivan, leads to despair. Passion alone, Dmitri, leads to destruction. But faith combined with love, Alyosha, creates the possibility of genuine human flourishing. Not easy flourishing. Alyosha's life isn't comfortable or simple, but meaningful flourishing. The sense that you're participating in something larger than yourself, something eternal, something worth the cost. Now, Dostoevsky never finished the second volume, where Alyosha's story would presumably continue. We don't see him tested the way Ivan and Dmitri are tested. Some readers see this as a weakness. Alyosha remains somewhat idealized, but I think Dostoevsky's death before completing the work is itself meaningful. It shows that the life of faith is always incomplete, always in progress. Alyosha isn't a finished saint. He's a developing believer. And that's more honest than showing him as perfect and untested. The three brothers also represent three stages many people go through. You might start as Dmitri, passionate, pleasure-seeking, not thinking deeply about ultimate questions. Then something makes you wake up, become self-aware, start questioning. You become Ivan, analytical, troubled, unable to accept easy answers. And if you're fortunate, through suffering and love, you become Alyosha, maintaining intellectual honesty while choosing faith, active in the world while rooted in prayer. But here's the key insight. You don't leave the other brothers behind. Even as Alyosha, you still have Ivan's doubts and Dmitri's passions. The three brothers aren't just three different people. They're three dimensions of every human soul. We all have the doubting intellect, the passionate appetite, and the believing heart. Christian maturity isn't eliminating the first two. It's integrating all three with the third as the organizing principle. Think about how this works psychologically. Your intellect will always generate doubts. That's what intellects do. They question, analyze, find problems. Ivan in you never goes away. But if Alyosha is primary, you can hold doubts without being controlled by them. You can acknowledge genuine problems with faith while still choosing faith. Similarly, your passions will always pull you toward pleasure, comfort, self-protection. Dmitri in you never goes away. But if Alyosha is primary, you can experience desire without being enslaved by it. You can enjoy life's pleasures without making them your God. This is psychological integration that Christianity makes possible, not by suppressing intellect or passion, but by putting them in right relationship to faith. Faith isn't opposed to thinking. It gives thinking a foundation and purpose. Faith isn't opposed to feeling. It channels feeling toward appropriate objects. The integrated person thinks clearly, feels deeply, and loves truly. The disintegrated person is torn apart by conflicting impulses, unable to commit fully to anything, because every commitment is undermined by doubt or desire. Here's what this means practically. If you're struggling with doubt, with sin, with brokenness, Dostoevsky says, you're exactly where Christianity starts. You don't qualify for grace by being good. You qualify by knowing you need it. The thief on the cross next to Jesus had no time for spiritual development, no opportunity to prove his change, just a moment of recognition and a plea for mercy. And Jesus said, "Today, you'll be with me in paradise." That's the scandal of grace. It's not earned, it's received. But receiving grace doesn't mean staying the same. Dostoevsky shows that real encounter with Christ changes you. Not all at once, not painlessly, but genuinely. Dmitri becomes capable of sacrifice. Raskolnikov becomes capable of love. Even Ivan, though we don't see his recovery, has the potential for it. If he can accept the kiss Christ gave the Inquisitor, if he can stop demanding justice and start accepting mercy. This transformation isn't self-improvement, it's death and resurrection. Your old self has to die. Your pride, your self-sufficiency, your illusion of control, all that has to be crucified. Only then can something new be born. This is terrifying, which is why people resist it. We'd rather improve than be transformed. We'd rather keep ourselves intact while becoming better versions of ourselves. But Christianity doesn't offer better versions of your current self. It offers death to that self and resurrection to new life. Paul says it explicitly. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. This isn't mystical metaphor, it's ontological reality. If Christian faith is true, then union with Christ means your very identity changes. You're no longer primarily defined by your ethnicity, your nationality, your achievements, your failures. You're defined by being in Christ, participating in his death and resurrection. Dostoevsky illustrates this through his characters' transformations. When they change, it's not superficial behavior modification. It's fundamental reorientation of their being, their values, their understanding of themselves and reality. But here's where modern readers struggle. We're therapeutic culture. We believe in growth, development, progress. We don't like the language of death and rebirth. It sounds violent, extreme. We prefer gradual improvement through therapy, education, self-care. And those things have value. But Dostoevsky says they're insufficient for real transformation. Because real transformation isn't about managing your personality better. It's about submitting that personality to something greater than yourself. It's about letting God transform you into who he created you to be, not who you've made yourself. This connects back to freedom. Remember, the Grand Inquisitor wanted to remove freedom because it's too heavy. Most people would rather be comfortable than free. But Dostoevsky shows that true freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to become who you were meant to be. And that requires grace, because you can't transform yourself. You can modify behaviors, but you can't change your fundamental nature through willpower. Only God can recreate you from within. Now the question is, what motivates this transformation? Fear of hell? Promise of heaven? Dostoevsky says something more profound. Gratitude. When you realize you're loved, despite being unlovable, that you're forgiven despite being guilty, that you're chosen despite being nothing special. That recognition creates overwhelming gratitude. And gratitude is the most powerful motive for change. Not because you're trying to earn what you've already been given, but because you want to live in a way that honors the gift. This is why Sonia can endure prostitution without becoming bitter or cynical. She knows she's loved by God regardless of her degradation. That knowledge protects her inner being, even while her outer life is hellish. And it's why she can love Raskolnikov. Not because she's earned the right to judge him, but because she's received the grace to see him as God sees him. Part 7. The final word. Why Dostoevsky's Christianity remains dangerous. Let me end with why Dostoevsky's vision of Christianity remains dangerous to both believers and non-believers. For believers, he's dangerous because he won't let faith be comfortable. He shows that real Christianity is costly, demanding, often anguished. You don't get to have certainty without doubt, faith without struggle, love without sacrifice. The Jesus of Dostoevsky's vision isn't the buddy Christ of contemporary worship songs. He's the crucified God who demands you take up your cross and follow him to death. That's not a marketing-friendly Christianity. It doesn't promise prosperity, success, or even happiness. It promises meaning, purpose, and ultimately joy, but only through suffering and transformation. For non-believers, he's dangerous because he shows that rejecting God has consequences. Not just eternal consequences in some afterlife, but immediate psychological and existential consequences. If God is dead, then meaning is subjective, morality is preference, and life is absurd. You can try to create your own meaning, but Dostoevsky shows that substitute meanings collapse under pressure. When suffering comes, and it will, what sustains you if there's no transcendent purpose? When evil triumphs, and it does, what stops you from becoming evil yourself if there's no objective morality? When death approaches, and it will, what hope do you have if this life is all there is? These aren't comfortable questions for anyone. Dostoevsky doesn't let anyone off easy. He demands that you think through the implications of what you believe or don't believe. He demands that you live consistently with your stated worldview. And when you try to do that, really try, you discover that both faith and faithlessness are harder than you thought. Faith because it requires trusting God in the face of horrors that seem to contradict his goodness. Faithlessness because it requires accepting that those horrors are meaningless and no justice will ever be done. So who was right, Ivan or Alyosha? Dostoevsky never fully answers this. Ivan's arguments are never refuted. His moral outrage at children's suffering remains valid. But Alyosha's faith continues despite Ivan's arguments. His love continues despite having no philosophical justification that satisfies reason. In a sense, both are right. Ivan is right that suffering can't be explained. Alyosha is right that it can be redeemed. The question is which truth you orient your life around, the truth of suffering's reality or the truth of love's ultimacy. Dostoevsky chose love, not because the arguments convinced him. He admitted his doubts lasted his whole life. But because when faced with the existential choice between nihilism and faith, between despair and hope, between death and life, he chose to bet everything on Christ. Not as intellectual conclusion, but as existential commitment. This is the leap of faith Kierkegaard described. Not a leap away from reason, but a leap beyond where reason can take you. Reason can get you to the edge. It can show you the stakes, map the terrain, identify the problems. But at some point, you have to choose. you have to jump. And you don't know for certain if there's ground on the other side. That's what makes it faith. But here's what Dostoevsky wants you to understand. Not choosing is still choosing. If you wait for absolute certainty before committing to Christ, you've already chosen against him. Because Christianity isn't about certainty. It's about trust. It's about saying, I don't have all the answers. I don't understand everything. I still have doubts. But I'm choosing to believe that the universe is ultimately good, that love is ultimate reality, that Christ rose from the dead, and that changes everything. That's a risky bet. You might be wrong. But here's the thing. Atheism is also a risky bet. You might be wrong about that too. The question isn't which position has certainty. Neither does. The question is, which position is worth betting your life on? Dostoevsky bet his life on Christ's resurrection. Everything in his mature work flows from that. If Christ rose, then death is defeated, suffering can be transformed, evil doesn't have the final word, and love is stronger than death. If he didn't, then Ivan's right. The universe is absurd, suffering is meaningless, and we're all just waiting to die. Dostoevsky looked at those two possibilities and chose to believe in resurrection. Not because it was easy. His letters show it was tormentingly difficult, but because the alternative was unlivable. And here's the final, crucial point. Dostoevsky doesn't ask you to admire his faith or accept his conclusions. He asks you to wrestle with the same questions he wrestled with, to look honestly at suffering without flinching, to consider seriously what it means if God exists or doesn't exist, to test your beliefs by trying to live them consistently, to be ruthlessly honest about what you actually believe versus what you claim to believe. That's his legacy. Not a system of theology, but an invitation to genuine philosophical and spiritual struggle. To think deeply, feel deeply, choose consciously. Read Dostoevsky, not as a dead authority to quote, but as a living challenger who won't let you be comfortable. Argue with him, doubt him, test his claims against your experience, but do so with the same intellectual honesty and existential seriousness he embodied. Don't settle for easy atheism that ignores the meaning problem. Don't settle for easy faith that ignores the suffering problem. Sit with the tension, bear the weight of the questions, and make your choice knowing what's at stake. Because everything is at stake. If Dostoevsky is right, then Christianity is the most important truth in the universe, and rejecting it means rejecting reality itself. If he's wrong, then he wasted his genius on beautiful lies. But either way, the questions he asked are the questions we all face, whether we acknowledge them or not. What does it mean to be human? Can we be truly free? Is love possible? Does life have meaning? Can the guilty be forgiven? Can the dead be raised? You have to answer these questions, even if your answer is to ignore them. Because ignoring them is an answer. It's saying they don't matter enough to think about. But Dostoevsky would tell you they're the only questions that ultimately matter. Everything else is distraction from the fundamental choice. Will you bet your life on love, on resurrection, on Christ? Or will you bet on something else, or on nothing at all? That's the Dostoevsky question. It's been 143 years since he died, and the question still won't leave us alone. It still demands an answer. It still splits reality in half. And maybe that's the most Dostoevskian thing of all, that the question itself is part of the answer. That being forced to choose, being unable to remain neutral, being confronted with ultimate stakes, is what makes us fully human. We're the only creatures who who have to decide what we believe about God, meaning, morality, death. We can't just act on instinct. We have to choose. And in that choosing, in that terrible freedom, we discover either everything or nothing. Dostoevsky discovered everything. He found, through suffering and doubt and struggle, that Christ's love is real, that resurrection is possible, that grace transforms, that life has meaning. Not because he had certain proof, he never did, but because he encountered something in the depths of his suffering that mere philosophy couldn't give him. He encountered the living Christ, and that encounter made all the difference. Whether you believe that's actually what happened, or just what Dostoevsky thought happened, depends on your own answer to his question. But either way, you can't deny the power of a faith that sustained him through Siberian prisons, epileptic seizures, gambling addiction, the death of children, financial disaster, and constant doubt. A faith that produced some of the greatest literature ever written. A faith that continues to challenge and transform readers a century and a half later. Let me emphasize what made Dostoevsky's faith so powerful. It wasn't based on having answers. It was based on encountering a person. He didn't believe because he'd resolved all philosophical objections to Christianity. He believed because in his darkest moments, in the labor camp, watching an Easter service through a prison window, reading the New Testament that was the only book prisoners were allowed. In those moments, he encountered Christ as a living reality, not a theological abstraction. That encounter didn't answer his questions. It gave him the strength to live with his questions. It gave him a foundation that philosophical doubt couldn't shake because it wasn't built on philosophy. It was built on relationship, on encounter, on knowing he was known. This is why his novels are populated not with systematic theologians, but with people who've met Christ in suffering. Sonia reading the Gospel to Raskolnikov by candlelight in a dirty room. Father Zosima blessing peasants who've walked for days to see him. Alyosha seeing Christ at the wedding feast of Cana in mystical vision after his crisis of faith. These aren't academic exercises. They're encounters that change everything. They're the difference between knowing about someone and knowing someone. You can know everything about your spouse, their biography, their preferences, their habits, and still not really know them if you've never been vulnerable with them, never opened your heart to them, never experienced their love transforming you. Dostoevsky is saying that's the difference between studying Christianity and being Christian. You can master theology, church history, biblical languages, and still completely miss Christ if you've never encountered him personally. Conversely, you can be theologically unsophisticated, unable to articulate the doctrines, and still know Christ deeply if you've met him in prayer, in suffering, in the face of your neighbor. This prioritization of encounter over doctrine makes some Christians nervous. They worry it's subjectivist, that it opens the door to everyone claiming their own private revelation. And that's a legitimate concern. But Dostoevsky isn't advocating for abandoning doctrine or tradition. He's saying doctrine and tradition point toward encounter. They're not substitutes for it. It's like a map and a territory. The map is useful, necessary even, for finding your way. But the whole point of the map is to reach the territory. If you spend all your time studying the map and never make the journey, you've missed the point. That's not proof of Christianity's truth, but it's evidence that it's a truth worth investigating. And that's all Dostoevsky would ask of you. Don't accept his faith. Investigate whether his faith might be true. Don't take his word for it. Test his claims against reality. Don't believe because he did. Believe or don't believe because you've thought it through for yourself. But whatever you decide, decide honestly. Look at the whole picture: the suffering and the hope, the doubt and the faith, the evil and the love. Don't cherry-pick evidence. Don't ignore what contradicts your preferences. And don't pretend neutrality is possible when it isn't. Here's what I think Dostoevsky would say to someone reading this right now. If you're a comfortable Christian who's never doubted, never struggled, never confronted the problem of evil, your faith is probably shallow. Not necessarily false, but untested. When suffering comes, when someone you love dies senselessly, when you encounter evil that makes you question God's goodness, your comfortable faith might collapse. You need to go through Ivan's crisis before you can have Alyosha's faith. You need to face the darkness honestly before your light is genuine. If you're an atheist who thinks believers are just afraid of death or need a psychological crutch, you're probably wrong about most believers, and you haven't taken the strongest case for Christianity seriously. Read Dostoevsky. Not the caricature of Christianity you've rejected, but the Christianity that acknowledges every objection you have and still chooses faith. See if your atheism can match its existential depth, its moral seriousness, its psychological insight. You might still conclude Christianity is false, but you'll have rejected something real, not a straw man. If you're agnostic, uncertain, seeking, Dostoevsky offers you both comfort and challenge. Comfort that doubt isn't failure, that struggling with faith is itself a kind of faith, that God doesn't reject questioners. Challenge that you can't stay neutral forever, that eventually you have to bet your life on something, that the stakes are too high to remain undecided indefinitely. He'd tell you to keep seeking, keep asking, keep knocking, but to seek with your whole being, not just your intellect. Pray, even if you're not sure anyone's listening. Read scripture, even if you're skeptical, it's divine. Serve the poor, even if you don't believe it has cosmic significance. Put yourself in positions where, if God is real, He can reach you. And if after genuine seeking you still can't believe, at least you've been honest about the search. But whatever you decide, decide honestly. Look at the whole picture: the suffering and the hope, the doubt and the faith, the evil and the love. Don't cherry-pick evidence. Don't ignore what contradicts your preferences. And don't pretend neutrality is possible when it isn't. Because the question Dostoevsky poses, the question of Christ, won't let you be neutral. It demands an answer. And your answer, whether you realize it or not, will determine how you live and what you live for. That's the scandal and the glory of Dostoevsky's Christianity. It's not safe, it's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's alive, it's real, it's demanding, and it promises that if you're willing to die to yourself, you can be born into something infinitely greater. Whether that promise is true is for you to discover. But knowing that the question matters, that your answer has consequences, that you can't escape choosing, that's the beginning of wisdom. And that's what Dostoevsky gives us. Not answers that settle everything, but questions that won't leave us alone. Questions that push us toward the only choice that ultimately matters. And in the end, that might be the greatest gift any writer can offer.